with Chainalysis. And what I have for you guys today is a little presentation on the state of cryptocurrency-related crime. There's a lot of content for the time that I have, so I'm going to go kind of fast. Feel free to catch me at the end if you want the slides or if you have some questions that we didn't have time to cover. But in a nutshell, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what happened over the last year before looking at some specific typologies. And so I mean things like terrorism financing and darknet markets and how they've been evolving most recently. And to wrap it up, we'll tie that together with some of the private-public initiatives that have been arising and developing to address some of these concerns. So let's jump right into it. And I think an interesting starting point is to look at what we consider to be the share of cryptocurrency-related activity that is considered to be illicit. And maybe some definitions here would be useful. When we're talking about illicit activity, what we're really doing is we're creating clusters of the addresses that we find to be controlled by one entity. So that could be a scam cluster or a darknet market. So we have different ways of grouping together all of these addresses. And then what we do is attribution. So we will give them a name and put them within one of these different typologies. And so over the last few years, actually, the trend was quite positive. If you look at the relative share of illicit activity, it was going down. But from 2018 to 2019, there's actually an uptick. So in relative terms, we went from about 0.4 here to about 1.1 over there. So overall, the takeaway is that it's still a very small amount of the activity that's tied to illicit entities, but it did go up last year. And it's interesting because last year was also a big year for compliance. So it was a big year for cryptocurrency-related compliance initiatives. So we're going to dive in deeper into the why here. But first, I think it's interesting to point out that there are some outliers when you look at all of this data. Here we're looking at, we're looking at different typologies again. So terrorism financing, scams, sanctions, things like that, darknet markets. And most of these are actually hard to see on the screen. The yellow is darknet markets, and it's been remarkably consistent over the last few years. The real thing that stands out here is that big spike in the first half of 2019. And that's part of the scams category. And specifically what we're seeing here is the plus token scam. It's a Ponzi scheme that took in billions, and it's making the share of illicit activity peak at over 3% there, which was quite high. So we're talking about a lot of money. And it's interesting to look at how the money laundering process compares to what we're seeing in the fiat world, because it is actually very, very similar. But first, a few observations. There's an infrastructure in place that's enabling this. We're going to look at some of the key components of it and who the players are. And it's actually a small amount of people that are doing the bulk of this processing of illicit funds. And I guess the third observation is that these insights are only possible with this research because of the public nature of the data. So it's interesting to look first at the off-ramps. So these are the places where criminals are converting the crypto assets back into fiat and making an exit. And there's a couple things I want to point out. Up till mid-2017, there was a big portion of these funds being laundered through what we call risky services. So these are exchanges, for example, that don't do any sort of KYC, AML. And it falls off suddenly mid-July, right? That coincides with the takedown of a few big platforms that were being used for money laundering. I'm thinking about BTCE and WEX, for example. And the guy who was behind BTCE, Alexander Vinnik, was actually just extradited to France from Greece, as opposed to Russia, which is where he wanted to go. And the other trend that's interesting is this really big increase on the right side in the yellow and the pink, sorry, category, which is exchanges, regular KYC exchanges. So why is it that criminals are turning to these more or less regulated platform? We'll look at that in a second. And it's not just a few players who are behind the majority of this activity. It's also just a few specific platforms. Here we're looking at Bitcoin only activity in 2019. So illicit funds processed by exchanges, and there's two outliers again, Huobi and Binance, which made up more than half of the laundering here. And so it's interesting, what's up with APAC? Why is this even possible? Then there are reasons for that. We're going to dive in. Not going to spend too much time on this slide, but what we're looking at is, again, Binance and Huobi accounts. The interesting number is this 11 here. This is 11 accounts at Huobi and Binance that were responsible for 327 million in illicit funds laundering. When you compare that with over here, in the $0 to $100 range, you have 214,000 accounts doing laundering of illicit funds. So it's really just a few big fish that we're interested in here. And those are the guys that we're going to be talking about in the next few slides or so. And so it's really hard for our analysts and researchers to get data on what's going on here, because we're talking about brokers, OTC brokers that are using these platforms for liquidity. What Chainalysis did was we have a professional services team. So these are investigators that have a background in anti-money laundering and terrorism-related intelligence, stuff like that, that are now collaborating with our analysts and researchers to work on the APAC OTC situation. And they are putting together this list we call the Rogue 100. So through their investigative work, they're able to find addresses that are connected to these OTCs. And this is something that we are using a lot in our analysis now. So it's called the Rogue 100. And I guess the main takeaway is that in Europe and other jurisdictions, OTCs go through a lot of KYC, AML, but it's all dependent on the region. APAC in particular is for us a cause of concern and something that we're looking at very closely. So scams, it's good to start with this because it's making up such a big part of the fund flows. They're on the rise. They typically target vulnerable people, so they can be new investors, people who are excited about getting into crypto, and too trusting, or older people. But really anybody can fall victim because the scams can be so sophisticated. But again, we find that there's a small number of organized groups that are responsible for a lot of this activity, and that they rely on some of these corrupt OTC brokers. I don't know if you heard, 2 or 3 days ago, there was an announcement by OFAC, the Office for Foreign Asset Control, that 2 Chinese individuals were blacklisted and 20 Bitcoin addresses added to the OFAC blacklist because they were found to have laundered more than 200 million for Lazarus, which is a group with ties to North Korea. We're going to talk about those guys in a minute as well. But in our systems, Chainalysis, we will flag these addresses and trigger alerts for our clients if anybody sees a transaction that has any links to these groups. Still on the scams, still with Ponzi's. So what we see here on the screen is 2017, 2018, 2019, and different types of scams. There's investment scams, Ponzi schemes, obviously, but also fake token sales and blackmail. A couple things jump out right away. There's a lot of orange on the screen. That's the Ponzi schemes. And there's a big uptick also from 2018 to 2019. So in 2017, that big orange blurb is BitConnect. I'm sure some of you have heard about the BitConnect Ponzi scheme. In 2019, there's a number of them. There's about 6 Ponzi's in there, but the plus token is really making up the bulk of that column that you see there. And again, and this might be counterintuitive for people who know blockchain well, scammers have been mainly relying last year on exchanges to off-ramp their loot. But when you look at the APAC situation and what's going on with Wobi and Binance, for example, maybe it starts making a little bit more sense. So a few takeaways. These platforms need to educate their customers. If it looks too good to be true, it probably is. Don't send your crypto to somebody who's promising to send triple amount back. Nobody does that. So there's an infrastructure in place that's enabling this laundering, and it's important to educate ourselves around this situation on the whole. And ransomware, I find to be extremely fascinating. It's evolved a lot recently. We see the emergence of two big categories. There is the traditional ransomware that, with large criminal groups behind them, or perhaps even nation-level actors, they're targeting specific entities, specific targets, and they either want really big payouts or they don't care about the money at all. It's just about creating chaos, and that's what we saw in Ukraine with the NotPetya strain, which encrypted lots of systems, you know, hospitals, everything. Even Maersk lost, the shipping company lost hundreds of millions, and there were no keys or there was no passwords to decrypt. They really just wanted to create a lot of chaos, which is what they did. Another thing that's interesting is that a lot of the victims are in North America. A lot of the payments are coming from North America, but we're seeing the share evolve quite quickly. What we're looking at here is a number of different ransomware strains and how they were dominating, what their market share was over, and how that share evolved over time. You see that up until 2016 or so, there were a few big strains dominating. They had big, powerful criminal groups behind them. They were very sophisticated. But then you see it's all splintering up a little bit, and there's more competition between these strains. And this coincides with the emergence of RAS, or ransomware as a service. So it's now possible to go on a darknet forum or a platform and buy with cryptocurrency software that will help you infect other computers with ransomware. It's really falling into a different category. So what we're looking at here are different strains, these columns, and the size of the column is the average payment that they will command. The color red is that first category, which typically is backed by an organized criminal group or a state actor, and the yellow ones are strains that are specific to ransomware as a service. So you'll see right away that the payments that these RAS softwares get are much smaller. So what people are doing is they're buying this software on the darknet and just sort of casting a big net and hoping that something sticks. So it's a very different approach than the other more traditional ransomware. And this is what I was saying about North America making up the majority of the victims. But more recently, we've seen the global and European shares increase significantly. This is also a very interesting example. It's a specific ransomware as a service strain called Sodinokibi. We're looking here at two different transactions, which are ransomware payments. And this is an interesting strain because the developer has actually built a functionality in the software that will immediately send a portion of the payouts to that creator. And the rest goes to the person who bought it on the dark web and deployed it. So these ransomware tools can be very sophisticated, really interesting. Some of them have customer support on both sides. On the side of the victim, if the victim doesn't know how to buy Bitcoin, there will be a little number. Please call this number. We'll explain how to buy Bitcoin. And on the other developer side as well, it's just crazy. And so a few things that we recommend, of course, is to not be quiet. We need to be able to assess the size of the problem as a whole, but also just we want these victims and companies, typically their companies, to be aware that there's a lot you can do to trace funds. And we've worked a lot with insurance companies and all the other types of victims to do recovery successfully. I mean, of course, then there's other types of ransomware. There's sextortion that are targeting individuals, but here we're mainly looking at organizations and larger entities. So hacks, they've been getting a lot more sophisticated. We're going to look at an interesting example by Lazarus, the North Korean linked group. What we're looking at here is hacks of exchanges, so not investment companies, not online wallets, only hacks where the funds of the platform or the users were accessed. So not exit scams. And also we removed some hacks that were reported to us privately as long as it didn't significantly skew the data. So I'll point out a couple of things. The 2014 column is Mt. Gox. The big pink blurb in 2018 is CoinCheck. And a few things that are obvious right away is that the number of hacks that fall into this category is still increasing. From 2017 to 2019, you see there's a big increase. But the size of the amounts being hacked are becoming smaller. In 2019, that's obvious with the height of the column. What we take away from that is that these platforms are becoming more adept at using cold storage and managing their funds in a secure way. But there's still a lot of attacks being made, and the level of sophistication is really impressive. I like this example. This is the Dragon X platform. They were hacked for about 7 million USD worth of crypto last year by what was later determined to be Lazarus. And they did something pretty sophisticated. They built a fake website, fake social network profiles. But they also went a step further. They pretended that this company was making a trading bot, and they claimed that they wanted access to the exchange for liquidity, and they started seducing some of the people at that platform, offering a free trial of the trading bot, which they actually built. But there was also software in there which could grab private keys, which is what happened. So the one thing that the exchange did well was to report it immediately, and we were able to disseminate a list of the addresses where the funds had first been sent. And so at some exchanges where the criminals tried to convert the funds to Bitcoin before layering it somewhere else, we were able to capture that and freeze those funds. But what we're looking at here is the hack starting here. There was Ethereum, Litecoin, a few other things sent to a number of exchanges. Those are the yellow dots. Those are the exchanges where the criminals tried to convert the assets to Bitcoin, which is what they did before sending it to these little black dots, which are private wallets, which they then forwarded to this CoinJoin Wasabi wallet, which has a CoinJoin protocol. So this is where this was all consolidated again, and I'm pretty sure that's where we stopped tracking it. Very interesting case. And the way that these criminals are now off-ramping or exiting the crypto has also changed. We're looking at 2017, 2018, 2019, and they used to rely heavily on these low KYC exchanges, but in the last year, they've also started using these CoinJoin wallets, which we've just mentioned, and letting that big blue blurb is the unspent. So they're letting funds sit somewhere much longer now. And that could be for different reasons. Maybe they're thinking about other ways they can use to layer this and put it back more efficiently in the system. So this is what we recommend. Report it quickly because we can actually freeze these funds as soon as they hit exchanges when we have a blacklist. So darknet markets, we're going to go quite quickly. There's a big uptick in activity here over last year. Specifically, it's not just drugs. You can buy PDFs, you can buy hacking kits, and that uptick is what we see there in the yellow bar going up from 2018 to 2019. That's the uptick in the relative share. Big drop from 2015 there, which was sort of the golden age. But in absolute terms, the money spent is the highest it's ever been at almost 800 million. So that's concerning. And these platforms are sophisticated, you know. So this is an empire market. You can buy. There's thousands of listings. There are reviews. It's like any other sort of platform where you can buy and sell goods. And they're in competition with each other. So here you have different platforms. Alphabet, which was totally dominating in 2016. But now you see it's splintered again, and we have the Empire Market, which is again becoming very prominent. And so like I said, it's not just drugs. You can also buy credit card information, for example. This is something that we will tag in our systems as well, and that we work a lot with financial institutions to make this obvious to them. So recommendations again to educate yourself. The strategies used by the criminals are always evolving. For financial institutions, we recommend they pay extra attention to carding shops. This is the last typology we're going to talk about. Terrorism financing, also still in its infancy. It used to be literally a guy posting his deposit address at Coinbase on a Twitter, and obviously that would get captured right away and reported. But it's becoming more sophisticated. Like, for example, they have landing pages now that will generate a unique address for any person that visits that website, then asking that person for funds. So it's evolving quickly, and we have our eyes on it, but we still see a lot of misinformation. For example, these sensationalist titles, breaking, ISIS used Bitcoin to fund these bombings because somebody started doing research but with an incomplete data set. So there's an analysis firm that was looking at this deposit address here at coin payments, and there was very little activity there, but they started looking at the transactions, and they saw one transaction for $10,000 April 2019 with this address over here. So they made a report that there was a lot of financing going on, especially since this other address which they were looking at had processed more than 150 million. But we took another look at it, and we quickly figured out that both of those addresses were within the same organization, and they were actually looking at how that company was managing the funds internally, so they reached the wrong conclusions. The same thing sort of happened here. This is in Israel with Hamas. There was an address at a Gaza-based money service called Cash for PS. And so they were looking at this, and they saw that the cluster had processed more than 3,370 Bitcoin, today worth about 23 million, which obviously looks like a huge amount of money. But again, they were using an incomplete data set. Most of those transactions were happening way before the Gaza, that address was being used for any sort of terrorism financing. Also, of that amount, a very small amount was actually received from the outside. The majority were internal fund flows. So really, public data is not enough. You need to contextualize it, enrich it, and that's what blockchain analysis companies are doing. Thank you so much. Maybe time for a question or two.
Wait, can you guys just do that outside, I guess? Or
yeah, no problem.
Yeah, sorry about that. Good speech, dude. How would it take to make?
Putting it together?
Yeah.
Not that long, because most of it is taken from a report, the cryptocurrency report that we put out. So I just screenshotted a bunch of stuff. Probably took a couple hours.
When was that report done?
It was published at the end of the month, at the end of January.
Okay.
Still quite fresh. Those guys were either finance, us personally, we were able